Good. Thanks. Okay, welcome. So this is the fifth class in the series, Who's Who and What's What in Jewish Philosophy, and it will deal with issues about state and religion in the 19th century, but really still very relevant today, as I hope you will see. And there's lots of interesting historical detail about this, but what I really want to try to focus on is the philosophical issue about the nature of the state and citizenship and the Jewish contribution to that question. Pictures on the handout concern one of the major events of modern Jewish history, the convening of the Sanhedrin by Napoleon in 1807. Now, there had been no Sanhedrin for a very long time. When exactly the Sanhedrin stopped functioning is not entirely clear, but somewhere in late antiquity, although after the destruction of the Second Temple. But the Sanhedrin had been the highest court and the legislative body of Judaism. So why was Napoleon convening this Sanhedrin? Well, there was a promise there, and there was also a threat. And I think that the development of Jewish participation in the life of the state has always been connected both to that promise and that threat ever since. You will see, on the one hand, there is an engraving here. There were really two different groups that met, by the way. There was first the Assembly of Jewish Notables, and they had various discussions, and then a group of rabbis led by Rabbi David Zinsheim. And the group of rabbis was really supposed to endorse with their rabbinic authority the decisions which had pretty much already been made by the Jewish notables. And all of this was determined, the agenda was determined by Napoleon himself and by a set of questions which I've got on the handout that he raised. And as we'll see, they are quite pointed questions. You'll also notice on the medal there, Napoleon giving the law to the Jews, and the rather humble looking Jew in rags receiving the law from Napoleon, which puts Napoleon in what position exactly?
Next to God.
Yes, right. That there was a sort of threat involved, as well as the promise of equal citizenship, I think becomes clear even from the beginning of the French Revolution. So if you look at the first text on the handout, the Comte de Clermont-Tonnerre had been defending the Jews against various charges in the French National Assembly. This is in December 1789. But he made what I think is a very important remark. He said this: the Jews should be denied everything as a nation, but granted everything as individuals. They must be citizens. It is claimed that they do not want to be citizens, that they say this and are thus excluded, but there cannot be one nation among another nation. It is intolerable that the Jews should become a separate political formation or class in the country. Every one of them must individually become a citizen. If they do not want this, they must inform us, and we shall then be compelled to expel them. So, granted everything as individuals, that's the promise. Individual citizenship. And, Jews had become citizens of the Roman Empire in 221. But about, almost exactly 100 years later, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, and that began a century or two of gradual erosion of Jewish civil rights, until by the 5th century Jews were no longer citizens of the empire, which had by then also become Christian. And from that time on, the history of Jews in Christendom is one of being subjects under various rubrics, but not being citizens, being barred from political office, from various kinds of protections. And I would say that life has been good for Jews under that regime to the extent that, first of all, there was no further persecution of them, as there sometimes was, and secondly, to the extent that they were able to exercise a certain delegated authority in their own self-government, and that varied from time to time and from place to place. But from that time on, from around the 5th century, Jews had not been citizens anymore of any of Christian countries. So Napoleon was really giving, when we get to Napoleon in 1807, he was offering something which had been denied to Jews for a very long time.
But the United States did it before that.
Yes, that's true. Jews were citizens of the United States. Not for very long, I suppose, but yes.
Well,
Right.
25, 30 years.
Yes, right. So no, the French were not the first. That is true.
And when did the British welcome them back?
Yes. Well, in typical British fashion, the issue was fudged. Jews were welcomed back under Cromwell in the 17th century, but the issue of their legal status was never really resolved. Various acts of parliament were proposed in the late 18th and early 19th century that would have granted Jews full citizenship. None of them passed. When it came time for, when a Jew was elected first to Parliament, the issue arose about whether a Jew could take his seat. Various things happened, but no general law was ever passed, and the acceptance was gradual, and that is a very typical British way of doing things. I have no problem with that. However, the reason why I focus on the French debate is because it raises the philosophical issues in a way that the British debate would not. And similarly, that's why I'm going to focus on the Jewish debate in Germany, not because there weren't Jewish debates elsewhere, but because that debate brings out some of the philosophical issues in a clearer way. So again, in America, I don't think there was any great debate about Jewish citizenship. So it certainly happened earlier, though, as you say. So Napoleon then would have thought of himself as really going back to the earlier stage of the Roman Empire and restoring the citizenship of the Jews. But again, notice in this statement in the French National Assembly that the Jews should be denied everything as a nation. Now, it did not used to be the case that there was one state per nation or one nation per state. There were lots of nations in any given country for the most part. A nation meant something like your ethnicity, your the locality from which you came, the province from which you came, the county sometimes. It didn't necessarily mean much more than that. The Jews constituted a separate nation too in that respect in Christian countries, but are in a rather special respect because they didn't have their own sort of geography, of course, except insofar as it was imposed on them in terms of rules of settlement, but they had their own rules to some extent, and as I said before, to the extent that self-government was delegated to them by the government. So, for the most part, Jews were governed by lay leaders plus rabbinic authorities. There were rabbinic courts that had various degrees of latitude with respect to disputes between Jews. Now, with the revolution in France, that whole structure, the Kehillah structure, was abolished. So this whole structure that had stood in between the individual Jew and the French government, the monarchy and so on, was gone. The courts ceased operating, and the situation was extremely unclear. And as we'll see, this was negotiated differently in different European countries, but Napoleon had very determinate ideas about what he wanted to do. However, those ideas involved the thought that there would now be one French nation. The state would be associated with one nation, and therefore the Jews could not be a nation anymore, and could not have their own laws if they were to be in France. And that's why already in that debate in 1789, there's a threat at the end that if the Jews want to be their own nation, they will have to be expelled. And these ideas will determine a lot of Jewish history for the next few centuries, of course. Here are some of the questions posed by Napoleon, first to the Council of Notables and then to the Sanhedrin. A lot of questions about marriage. That's one of the focuses. And as we'll see, in direct response to that, there are major rabbinic debates about the nature of marriage and the laws of marriage in the 19th century.
When they were doing this, Napoleon was doing this vis-a-vis the Jews.
Yes.
Were they doing it vis-a-vis anyone else, any other
Yes.
group? So this was not.
Right. So, to be sure, Napoleon wanted to have a sort of centralized authority that would deal with the Catholic Church, that would deal with the Protestants and so on. So you're absolutely right. This is not only the Jews.
The Huguenots.
Yes, to the extent that they were still Protestants in France, I think they were also reorganized at this time in a centralized fashion.
So, what other nationalities was in France?
Well, for example, people from the south of France had thought of themselves as having a separate nation, and that idea returned in the 60s and 70s, a certain kind of nationalism. But that all had to be obliterated, and there's a linguistic dimension to this in France and in Germany as well, right? Doing away with regional languages and dialects and trying to get everyone to speak the same French and so on. Yeah, people in the south had their own language, which they Languedoc. Yes. So here are some of the questions then. First of all, is it lawful for Jews to have more than one wife? Well, that was a relatively easy one for Ashkenazim to answer, although this is also interesting because Ashkenazim were treated differently in France than the Sephardim. The Sephardim were actually given citizenship earlier, and they were considered to be more French and more settled. But the Ashkenazim were still Yiddish speaking and were considered to be rather foreign. But at any rate, they were able to say, no, we don't have polygamy anymore, at least since the 11th century. Is divorce allowed by the Jewish religion? And is it valid by virtue of laws in contradiction to the French code? Now, both in this question and especially the third one, which was the hardest one to answer, the issue is really about whether there is a separate set of Jewish laws and Jewish legal institutions with respect to marriage and divorce that is separate from and perhaps contradictory to French law. That was the big issue. And this was very difficult for the rabbis to answer, in fact. The idea was that there has to be, from Napoleon's point of view, the possibility of intermarriage among citizens, and if something about the Jews gets in the way of that, then that's a problem for their citizenship. So the rabbis, in responding to this, introduced a rather novel interpretation of a Talmudic principle. The principle associated with Shmuel, the 3rd century CE, which it would be interesting to compare those, although I don't have the historical background in 3rd century Persia to do it. But he said this at the time when, I believe, the beginning of when the Sassanids took over the Persian Empire and introduced a whole new set of laws, and a lot of Jewish self-government was taken away, and the issue arose for the Jewish courts: if the government takes Reuven's property and gives it to Shimon, is that valid under Jewish law? If the non-Jewish government does this, and Shmuel held that it is valid. Dina de Malchuta Dina, in Aramaic, the law of the kingdom is the law. Now, that's got many, many applications in halacha afterwards, but always with respect to property rights. And what these rabbis did, rather under duress, was to apply it to personal status. And they said, well, look, our principle is that the national law comes first, prior to Jewish law. So they said in both cases, in order to have a Jewish divorce, there must first be a civil divorce. In order to have a Jewish marriage, there must first be a civil marriage. And that's an entirely novel notion. Yes?
So if a French
French man wants to marry a Jewish woman who, let's say she's been married to a Jewish man, but considers herself estranged, and her husband won't give her a get,
Mm-hmm.
she can go ahead and get married under French law.
Yes.
And she just can
Yeah.
never marry another Jewish guy.
Correct.
Which she maybe wouldn't intend.
Yes. That's right.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's the same
it's the
thing.
same thing. Yeah.
In Aguinaldo, so that
Yes.
Do they still have, do they have the same question if a Frenchman wanted to marry an English woman? Because you talked a minute ago
Mhm.
that, they had
Right.
these questions about other people. Do
Yes.
they have laws there also about who,
Well,
that they could
I
marry?
the main other way in which this comes up is with Catholics, and in fact the rabbis point that out, that the Catholic Church was not very fond of Catholics marrying non-Catholics either. So there's certainly parallels. But what the government wanted, and I think what the rabbis felt they had to give, was an assurance that intermarriage was okay. Now the rabbis were very, very careful about that, and it's their answer to the third question that is the most complicated, right? Which is whether a Jewess may marry a Christian or a Jew may marry a Christian woman, and so on. So they said, look, there's nothing in the Torah about intermarriage with Christians, because Christians are not mentioned. Certain idolatrous nations are mentioned, and Jews are not allowed to marry them, but Christians are not idolaters. At the same time, they said, Jewish marriage is kiddushin, it's a sort of sanctification, and that only works if both parties recognize the sanctity of marriage in the same way. So that can only happen between Jews. And therefore, they said, the rabbis do not encourage intermarriage between Jews and Christians. However, again, on the other side, if it should happen nevertheless that a Jew would marry a non-Jew, this would be valid. And the person would retain their Jewish status. So that's their rather complicated answer. They don't want to say that they're encouraging intermarriage, but they say there isn't really any obstacle to it from the point of view of Jewish law. And this explicit statement that a Jew would not lose their Jewish status by intermarrying is quite novel, because that question had never really been raised before. So this will lead to many debates in Germany in the 19th century as well about the nature of Jewish marriage. And I'm not going to read out all the rest, but basically it's about whether the rabbis exercise some sort of enforced, coercive authority over Jews, which they had done until now. The court system did have some sort of enforcement, but that had lapsed with the revolution, and therefore they said, well, no, we don't do that. Of course, in the rest of Europe, it still was the case that Jewish courts had some sort of enforcement measures. They could fine people, they might have been able to put you in a cell, and so on. It was limited, and it depended on the delegation of that authority by the non-Jewish government. And then there are questions about interest and usury. Hard to say what usury is. Excessive interest, very difficult to define. Now, even though the Jews gave the answers which they thought Napoleon wanted to give, while trying very hard not to compromise their halachic principles, this Sanhedrin was followed in 1808 by the so-called infamous decree. So, notwithstanding their answers, Napoleon introduced a law that declared all Jews guilty of financial chicanery unless proven innocent. Right? So the onus was on you to prove your innocence. Debts to Jews, many of the debts were cancelled. Jewish rights of residency were limited, and although other French citizens had the right to find a substitute if they were drafted, Jews did not anymore. So it's not hard to see, as I say, that in this promise of equal citizenship, there is a not very veiled threat as well. That Jews had better change their behavior or their perceived behavior and some of their ways of doing things if they're going to be accepted. Now,
What was the
yes,
rationale for that?
for the decree. Well, I think
I mean, would they have any trouble getting Jews to get with the program, or?
that was certainly the perception. Now, whether that was true or not is very hard to say, because they weren't, it's not as though there were studies done, but the perception was that Jews were involved in taking excessive interest, that they were not upright when it came to commercial dealings. Again, how much, we don't have figures on this, right? It's perception. Is it anti-Semitism? Does it have a basis? I don't know.
Were there any Jews in government?
No.
No Jews in the French government?
No, not at that time, so far as I know. Although there were some Jews who were involved in the revolution, but I don't think there were any Jews who had.
It was the worst
Position.
revolution.
Yes, but I don't think in the Napoleonic government that they did at this point. Also, there was a sort of centralization of Jewish communal life, the organization of the consistories, consistoire. So you had, each department had its own consistory with a chief rabbi and various other functionaries, and then there was a central consistory with the chief rabbi of France, and that system still exists. And the rabbis are selected by notables who are appointed by the government. And that, I believe, is still true. Now, this wasn't only in France, because it was wherever Napoleon had conquered at that time, so it included parts of Germany as well. And those are just the parts of Germany where you're going to afterwards see the most development in terms of Jewish thinking, most progressive thinking, not accidentally. And in fact, the first reform service in Germany was held in Westphalia, and it was run by the person who was appointed as the head of the consistory under the Napoleonic regime. Okay, so Jews could be citizens then, but they had to prove that they were worthy of citizenship, and they had to give up any sense of their collective identity as a nation, as well as all vestiges of having the sort of authority that a state should have. And you may recall, Mendelssohn had said, not that long before, Judaism is not really a revealed religion in the sense that Christianity is, it is a revealed law. The Jewish people have their own virtual state, and although he was also arguing that they should give up coercive force, he was not arguing that they should give up law itself. But that was a natural step that some of his successors would take after his death, and one of the motivations for doing that was to meet the conditions for citizenship as declared by Napoleon. Now, that's the sort of political challenge, to prove yourself worthy of citizenship. There were also philosophical challenges, and in particular associated with the philosophy of Kant. Kant distinguishes between two kinds of ethics. Autonomous ethics are really based on the notion of rational self-government. I, as an individual, govern myself in accordance with reason. And that is true morality from Kant's point of view. All other systems of ethics are heteronymous, meaning to say they are not systems of self-government, but the individual is governed by something other than the self. Now, it could be that you are governed by your own desires, which are not rational. So that's a form of heteronomy. But it could also be that you're governed by some law that someone else gives you. For example, you're the slave and the master gives you the law. Or you're a human being and God gives you the law. That is also heteronymous and not a form of morality as far as Kant is concerned. What place is there for religion in Kant's thinking? Well, religion, he says, is an aspect of morality. If it's not part of morality, then it's not really religion at all. It's something else. In particular, there's an aspect of morality that involves one's hope for future perfection. And this is a future perfection that we humans can contribute to, but we can never fully bring about. We're not powerful enough to do that. We're finite. And we need God to do it. So Kant has an elaborate account of why, in order to be a sort of full moral agent, you have to hope for a perfect future, even if we will never live to see it, and even if we can never attain it. And that involves belief in God as the one who will bring it about ultimately. So for Kant, religion is a subsidiary part of morality. Now, the greatest danger, from Kant's point of view, is posed by pseudo-religions. That is to say, it looks like religion, it sounds like religion, but it isn't religion, because it's not really part of morality at all. And the reason it's not part of morality is because it's heteronymous. And the prime example for Kant of this sort of confusion and absurdity is, of course, Judaism.
Why?
Because Judaism involves the slave-like subjection of human beings to God's law. Christianity is also problematic precisely because it has Jewish roots. If Christianity were to purify itself of Judaism, it would be pretty good. And that is exactly Kant's view. Right? So Judaism is really a form of politics, masquerading as morality, and that is very dangerous from Kant's point of view. Christianity, insofar as it has a political structure, is too Jewish. But Christianity has elements that can be saved, and Judaism does not.
Yeah, but Christianity has the extreme. It has a Pope,
Yes.
which is governs all.
And Kant is no fan of the Pope. So insofar as the Pope is too Jewish for Kant.
Remember?
Yes. So now some Jewish philosophers who were influenced by Kant, so now we're talking about the late 1790s and the early 1800s, and some of them had studied with him in Königsberg. Remember, I mentioned last time, he had Jewish students, and with respect to Jewish individuals, he was extremely helpful and supportive in a way that most people at the time were not. Some of these philosophers, like Lazarus ben David and Sol Asher, called for either the reform or the abrogation of what was called the ceremonial law, that is to say, Jewish ritual. And instead, they thought Judaism should refocus on prophetic morality, which they thought could be interpreted to be the same as what Kant meant by morality, autonomous morality. And among other things, that would show that Jews were worthy of citizenship. So that proposal was made already in the 1790s. Kant read Lazarus ben David's book. Ben David was quite a young guy at the time. He had known Maimon, whom I talked about last time, when Ben David was a boy, and Maimon had a big influence on him. But he eventually became the head of a Jewish school. Kant did not understand Ben David's proposal. Ben David was talking about a reform of Judaism, not about Jews becoming Christians. But for Kant, that was very hard to understand. So in the long passage, which I'm not going to read out here, Kant basically says, well, what Ben David must mean is that Jews, even if they're not going to become Christians, will accept the religion of Jesus. And I think he may have in mind a distinction that Mendelssohn's friend Lessing had drawn between the Christianity on the one hand and the religion of Jesus himself on the other hand. Jesus himself being a sort of Jew, of course. But Kant says, in the middle of that passage, the religion of Jesus, presumably with its vehicle, the gospel. And that was not something that I think Ben David had in mind at all. Ben David had in mind a refocusing of Judaism on prophetic ethics or morality, and he felt that much of rabbinic Judaism had been a perhaps understandable response to Christian persecution. And if Christian persecution would be removed, then it would also be possible to remove some of the rabbinic rules that governed the relations between Jews and non-Jews. And here comes the notorious statement of Kant, which I also mentioned last time. This is the bottom of page 3, about 5 lines from the bottom. Kant says, "The euthanasia of Judaism is pure moral religion, freed from all the ancient statutory teachings, some of which were bound to be retained in Christianity as a messianic faith." So that's what Kant is calling for. Right? Kill off Judaism, not only among the Jews, but in the Christian world as well, and you will achieve the purification of moral religion. And this, he says, this division of sects too, that's to say between Jews and Christians, must disappear in time, leading at least in spirit to what we call the conclusion of the great drama of religious change on earth, the restoration of all things, when there will be only one shepherd and one flock. So eventually he sees the distinction dying out
Distinction
between Jews and
Mhm.
non-Jews, Jews and Christians.
Now, it opens the door to certain aspects of belief that the Nazis had.
Well, all of this certainly provides a background to the Nazis, but to lots of other things as well. Right? So yes, the idea of the nation state in France, sure, that was important to the Nazis, but of course Napoleon did not have the idea that the nation was defined racially. That was the crucial Nazi addition. We have the idea of the nation state, but then the question is, what constitutes the unity of the nation? Is it a set of common commitments? Is it a common history? And I think that these are important philosophical questions that are raised with respect to Jews. So this is the place where the rubber hits the road, and you know, when the Jews are in discussion, sometimes it has bloody consequences, but this is where the big issues are debated. Sometimes not very rationally, but it's where they are debated.
Now, the thing of Nazism, of taking the Judaism out of Christianity.
Yes, absolutely. They were very much influenced indirectly, shall we say, by Kant, because most of the Nazis were not great intellectuals. The traditional view in Christianity, going all the way back to the Council of Nicaea and the big fight with various Gnostics, is that Christianity preserves a certain Jewish heritage. And that was fought out in various ways against Marcion and against Mani and so on in late antiquity, early Middle Ages. What happens after Kant in German Christianity, not everywhere, but in certain parts of the Lutheran world, is the return of Marcionism, the return of the idea that Christianity should get rid of its Jewish roots and cut them off, as it were. And that is a return to an older idea, but it's something that had very serious implications for Jews.
What was Kant's view?
Kant was a sort of Lutheran. This is much debated. He was not a big fan of organized religion at all, and he came from a pietist background. He almost never went to church, and even when he was the rector of the university and was supposed to be there, he always found some excuse not to go. He wrote several major works on religion, including Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, which interprets Christian doctrines as part of autonomous ethics or morality. So people have debated whether this is sincere or what it is. I have no reason to think that it's not sincere, but I think that he did not like the political, organized church aspect of Christianity at all.
How do you explain that? Can you give me an example of that? Give us an example. How do you pull out Buddhism out of Christianity? I mean, what part would they take out? Ten Commandment? I mean, what
Well,
is it?
so there are different versions of that. Kant's is fairly moderate compared to what comes after him. So he thinks, yes, the political structure of the church, that's what he has in mind. Fichte, who was a follower of Kant's, has a much more extreme version, and he actually thinks that almost all of the biblical books should be removed. The only thing he kept was the Gospel of John. Well, that's a complicated story, but that's the one where the Jews are addressed as the children of the father of lies. And it doesn't seem, nowadays scholars think that it's by Jewish Christians, but
Lies.
lies. Satan.
Yes.
Oh, L-I-E-S.
Yes.
I didn't know
Right,
it was a.
yes. So it reads as a very anti-Jewish gospel, although now a lot of scholars think it's actually written by Jewish Christians, which that's usually the case, right? That, the most anti-Jewish things are said by Jews.
So what gives then the compass or the direction for the individual in terms of physical, moral direction?
Well, reason. and he has a story to tell about how you engage in moral reasoning, and he has a certain picture of how that works. He also thinks that we can reinterpret Christian doctrines to fit with it, to fit with reason. Yes.
But I don't understand how that becomes sort of a normative, rationality becomes a normative guiding principle. It's rational to be, to feed orphans. It's rational to,
Yes.
if you let them die, there's more for everybody else.
Right.
That's rational.
So, Kant has a detailed story about this, which I'm not going to go into. The short version of it involves what's called universalization. Right, so the basic idea is that in a moral principle, I do not make an exception of myself, but I have to be prepared to apply that to everybody. So, letting orphans die, well, one would have to ask whether, if one found oneself in the position of the orphan, that would also be an acceptable state of society, for example. Okay, so let's move on to page 4. So now I want to talk about Germany in the 19th century, and there the change is very gradual, but as I say, it really starts in the north, where the French had ruled during the Napoleonic years, and the Jews were emancipated during that time, but once the French were expelled and so on, that was retracted. And it's not accidental that in those areas, including Frankfurt, this was eventually a place where the most progressive ideas in Judaism were expressed early. So again, there had been a communal structure in all of the different sort of patchwork quilt of little states and principalities that was Germany at the time. There was the Kehillah, the community with its court system and its rabbis and its lay leaders, and they would levy taxes and administer civil justice and so on. So as emancipation spread, and sometimes, as I mentioned, it was granted and then it was retracted, and the legal status of Judaism was negotiated in lots of different ways depending on the specific locality. So, it's not until 1870-71, after the Franco-Prussian War, that you get the unification of Germany, and then you get a sort of national system. But until then, you've got lots of things happening in different places. And meanwhile, the religious orientation of each Kehillah really just depended on local politics. So you start to get, first of all, in the early 1800s, grassroots movements, and these were very small, towards reform of the synagogue service, and towards a change in the laws that governed especially relations between Jews and non-Jews. And this was only happening in those places where the influence of the Napoleonic rule had been felt at the beginning, and it was in specific, mostly urban centers among intellectual and wealthy elites. Most of German Jewry was still rural and was living in areas that were unaffected by this, and their lives did not change until much, much later in the century. But by the 1840s, already the change started to become tangible. Now, most of the rabbinic courts were no longer functioning, and this was not so much the grassroots movement as the principalities and local governments taking away that delegated authority. Because the idea that was coming from the West was that a true state should not tolerate another quasi-state with its own courts and its own laws. There were also, let's say, some what would now seem pretty moderate attempts at reforming synagogue liturgy and education, more teaching of general subjects and so on, not only Jewish subjects. Now, by the 1840s, I think the thing that's crucial is this. First of all, in certain urban centers, notably Frankfurt, the reform-minded lay leaders were now dominating the elected boards of the community. for the first time. They were getting a majority. And secondly, some of the younger rabbis were inclined similarly, and that was a new development as well. So there were rabbis who wanted to go along with some of these changes, or perhaps sort of get in front of them before they started without their authority. So the idea was to repeat the Paris Sanhedrin, and there were a series of rabbinic synods or conferences. Again, it was modeled explicitly on the Paris Sanhedrin, and they started, if you read the proceedings, by saying, well, we adopt what they said in Paris, that's our assumption, we're going to go from there. And they had much debate, especially about the third question regarding marriage. So there was one in Brunswick in 1844, Frankfurt 1845, and Breslau in 1846. And there were lots of big debates here about should they retain Hebrew in the service, what should be the status of Jewish marriage, and so on. But for the most part, the changes were pretty modest and gradual. What interests me, again, philosophically, are the people who were the extremists. Because those are the ones who had the principled views that you can have a debate about. So I'm not saying whether I would agree with any of them. It's just that I think the people who were more philosophically minded tended to have more principled and more extreme positions. And that comes out with the issue of secession from the community. Right, so till now, there was one unified community, and there were no denominations in Judaism. And your relation to the state went through the community. The first secession was Reform. There was one Reform community in Germany in the 19th century. Only one. And it was in Berlin. And it seceded from the Berlin community in the 1840s and appointed a man called Samuel Holdheim as its rabbi in 1847. I got a picture of him on the last page. He was a Talmudic prodigy who had been a traditional rabbi until very recently before that, and had been the head of the rabbinic court system elsewhere. But he had really come to a different view. And he wrote, I think, one of the most important books of the 19th century from a Jewish point of view, which is about the autonomy of the rabbis and the nature of Jewish marriage. And he argues for a complete separation of church and state. And he argues that in order to be citizens, Jews have to give up every last vestige of statehood and nationality. All halakha must therefore go, because there can be no law that is not the law of the state. All markers of Jews as a separate nationality must go. That will include the laws of kashrut, it will include circumcision, prohibitions on intermarriage, and so on. And he was the only rabbi of the time, I believe, who actually performed intermarriages. Nobody else agreed with him, and he had no followers no other communities followed in Germany.
Did the same Sanhedrin except
Well, they did not.
the one in Parliament?
No, and they didn't exist anymore. They only existed during that 1807 meeting. The Sanhedrin. It was never more. It never met again, and nobody else agreed with Holdheim. However, his closest followers left Germany, especially after the defeat of the revolution in 1848, came to America, and they founded American Reform Judaism, which adopted the most radical ideas that only Holdheim had espoused in Germany. He also moved Shabbat to Sunday. Yes.
I find where it says adopting the state Sabbath
Yes.
as your Sabbath. I find that very interesting
Yeah.
because I know that my mother told me, who was in Strasbourg, which of course changed hands.
Yes.
But the Jewish kids, and this is in the 30s, went to gymnasium, and they went to school on Shabbos.
Yeah.
They didn't write.
No.
So these are Orthodox kids, they're not writing, and they're off on Thursday.
Yes. My grandparents had to do the same thing in
Right.
Germany. They had to go to school.
But
Yeah.
how did that square with, let's say it was German
Yes.
at that time?
Yes.
How did the Kehillah, which didn't exist anymore, how does this was just what was required not to be
Yes.
persecuted, or had,
Right, so I think more traditional observant Jews had a different attitude. And I'd say almost nobody accepted Holtheim's view, but his view is consistent. That's what I like about it. Right?
no, but the ripples still
Yeah.
affected
Yes.
Orthodox.
But the Kehillah structure did continue to exist in certain respects.
Yeah.
And that's why secession was necessary. So to this day, if you are a member of a religious community in Germany, you pay tax to the government. The government gives a portion of that money to your religious community, and it pays for the rabbi and whatever services. Now, under the law before 1876, you were stuck, if you were Jewish, in your community, and the only way to leave was to convert to Christianity and join another community. So if you were Reform living in an observant community, which most of them were, then you were paying money to support something you didn't agree with. Conversely, if you were Orthodox and living in Frankfurt, for example, where the community had now mostly become Reform, you were also paying money to the government that supported a system that you didn't agree with. Yes.
But as a citizen who was subscribing to all the laws of the state to
Yeah.
which you were a citizen of, if you owned property, you didn't have the right as a citizen to sell that property and say buy a house somewhere else?
Oh, sure. You could move.
But then
you
you
couldn't.
have to convert?
But then, well, you could move to another community, but you had to be a member of some community somewhere if you were Jewish. That was then required. It's not required now. So now that brings me.
So you said to leave, you have to convert.
Yes, to leave the community. I don't mean to leave physically, but to leave the Jewish community. The only way to do that was to convert.
Sorry, I thought you meant
So eventually a new law was passed, first in the Prussian government and then after unification of Germany. And that was the child, if you like, of Samson Raphael Hirsch, the leader of secessionist orthodoxy. Now, that was also a fairly small movement. Most Jews stayed part of the community. And eventually a system arose in Germany where there would be a somewhat like the structure we have here, except that it was governmentally endorsed, right? Where you had something like the Federation with its structures, and you had it supporting different kinds of schools, a more Reformed school, a more Orthodox school, an Orthodox synagogue, a conservative synagogue, and so on. But some Jews, on both ends, as it were, of the spectrum, felt that it was wrong to be part of this sort of community because they had to be supportive of things they did not endorse. So on the one hand, we have this this Reform secession in Berlin, and then we have the Orthodox secession in Frankfurt. And Hirsch was the person who mobilized people and eventually got this law passed. But the way he argued for the law is very interesting, which is on the basis of the autonomy of the individual citizen. So if I'm an autonomous citizen, then my money should, the religious disposition of my money should not be determined by the government. Now, at the same time, he was in favor of Jewish law, not like Holtheim, right? And of traditional observance, and so on. So, it can seem as though he's talking out of two sides of his mouth. He says Judaism is not a religion. This is one of his constant slogans. It's not like Protestantism, where it's just, you go to church or something on Sunday. And, it's not just one aspect of your life. Judaism is our nationality, and Judaism is our total way of life. So how can he say that on the one side, and on the other hand say, well, we have to have the freedom to choose as autonomous individuals to be part of an Orthodox community? And I don't think he ever fully answered that himself, but I think his grandson gave actually a much better answer. Let's check what time it is. Okay, yes, we're right. So his grandson was Isaac Breuer, who I think was a very major philosophical thinker. He was also one of the founding figures of the Aguda movement, which at the time was guided by this philosophy, although that did not last terribly long. And the basic thought was encapsulated in the slogan of Hirsch, but of other people as well, Torah im Derech Eretz, Torah together with the way of the land. So that's a quotation from Pirkei Avot. It has many different meanings, but the way that Hirsch and then his grandson Breuer understood it, it means that Torah can be synthesized with the best features of the surrounding culture. And that a Jew should live a full life as a citizen of the country in which he or she finds himself able to lead such a life, which will mean participating in business and in civic life and culture and so on. Not despite one's traditional Jewish observance, but in a way that is enriched by it. Now, the Derech Eretz of modern European life is founded on the idea of the autonomous individual. That, Breuer says, itself has Jewish roots and really comes from the idea that the human being was created in the image of God. Without that, we wouldn't have this idea of the autonomous individual at all. So what we have to do as Jews, from their point of view, is to find those features of the culture that are positive, which is to say, those features that are themselves resonant with features of Jewish tradition, and to contribute to those features and live a full life in that way. So here's, I think, the radical and non-traditional part of this way of thinking, which did not appeal to traditional Orthodox Jews, by the way. What follows from this idea of Hirsch and Breuer is that only the autonomous individual who is freed as a citizen of the state, and therefore freed from the traditionally coercive force of rabbinic law, and who then freely chooses to submit to rabbinic law, is truly living a Jewish life. And that is better than the life that our ancestors led in the ghetto. Traditionalist orthodoxy was committed to the view that we were basically doing it right all along, and that emancipation at best was removing a few obstacles, which had been very unfortunate, but it wasn't, helping us to be better Jews, right? Traditional Jewish life was perfectly fine as it was in Western and Eastern Europe in the Shtetlach and so on. Whereas the Hirsch-Breuer view is not that at all. It's that the proper Jewish life can only be led under the conditions of Western Europe or maybe America, where you are first a free individual and then you choose to be observed. Yes.
Say in the medieval times, if you had a Jew who was a doubter, he remained a Jew because of coercion, because where else was he going to go?
Right.
He had nothing else to do.
Yes.
So
And not only that, but if you spoke out disrespectfully or did something, you could be punished for it, physically punished. Yes.
I guess we're looking at this with modern eyes in terms of choosing your beliefs.
That's why this is radical.
Is
Yes.
seen more as a higher level of belief
Yeah.
than being Jewish out of habit or
Yes.
coercion. But I think that's our frame
Mhm.
because we're spreading.
Yes.
What was happening in England?
Well, in England at the time, you've got the gradual growth of a system that is intended to imitate the Church of England. So just as there is a Church of England with a primate, so there is a chief rabbi.
When did that start?
Well, it started really in the 17th, 18th century. In the 18th century, it really took off. Once the Ashkenazim split from the pre-existing Sephardi community, and you have the Board of Deputies, which is a Jewish equivalent of Parliament. Now, don't get me started on whether that will last, but that is the way it has worked. And again, there were various secessions from that, but only in the 20th century. No, that's not true. Already in the 19th century, there was a Reform secession. The first Orthodox secession was where I grew up, but in the early 20th century, there was a court case about it because the community wanted to conduct marriages, Jewish marriages. And according to British law at the time, only Jewish communities that were under the aegis of the chief rabbi were allowed to conduct marriages. My father is the marriage registrar for my community in the northeast of England. But there was a law case in which the Gateshead community sued the chief rabbi, and it did actually win independently.
So was there a third kind of string here with the Hasidim, or they didn't have any political philosophies and they fit like?
Right. So first of all, I've focused only on Western Europe here.
Okay.
Most Jews didn't fit into either of those two extremes. So they were part of the Einheitsgemeinde, the unity community, and some were more Orthodox and some were less Orthodox or whatever, and they usually had, by the end of the 19th century, there were usually at least 2 synagogues in any given place. But in rural communities, which is where my mother's family came from, there was only one, and it was very traditional.
But how was scholarship run? I mean, in Eastern Europe, you had 2 very different types of ideas of scholarship.
Yes.
What was the
Yeah, so that's a very interesting
university
question.
versus
Right.
Jewish scholarship?
Yes, so in Germany, what you see in the 19th century, it's astonishing, and I can't fully explain it, is a complete collapse of the traditional yeshivas. There were famous yeshivas in Germany. In what year? Well, a range of different years, but for example, probably the largest yeshiva in Germany was in Fürth, and that ceased functioning in the 1830s. And these rabbis who were part of these conferences had all been trained in these yeshivas, but they often presided over the demise of the same institutions. And the new institutions that would take over did not really come into being until the 1850s, and those were the theological seminaries. First in Breslau, I suppose you could call it conservative, it's hard to classify. A Reform one in Berlin, and then an Orthodox one in Berlin as well. But except for a couple of really quite minor places, like in a little village called Cell in Bavaria, there were no traditional yeshivas left.
So how could any of the Orthodox paskin, if nobody was, like make a judgment on Jewish law and ritual, if there was no passing on of this depth of knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
And also, I have a question about if that part of, if Gates had sued the chief rabbi,
Yeah.
like, does that mean they were seceding in they could grant a marriage over, for a couple to whom the chief rabbi might not have agreed to say, divorce them, or to the marriage,
Yes.
or the...
Exactly.
the
Yes, so
couple.
they wanted their own independent halakhic authority.
And they got it.
And they got it. But, so you're asking how there could be anyone. Well, as I say, new institutions came into being in the 1850s. There were still individual German rabbis of great scholarship, like Jakob Ettlinger, known as the Oriflaner, who was the teacher of both Hirsch and Hildesheim, who founded the seminary in Berlin. Some German Jews went to study in yeshivas in Hungary, in Pressburg, which was part of the Austrian Empire and was German-speaking as well. So there was that option as well. But yeshivas did not restart in Germany until under Hirsch's son-in-law, Solomon Breuer, he started a yeshiva in Frankfurt.
Is there a sense of what was the majority of the population? Were they assimilating because how small minority were the Orthodox?
Well, we're talking about the whole 19th century here. So there's
No,
a
I
big.
mean in Germany.
Yes, I know. So over time, there's a big change,
Yeah.
and it has a lot to do with urbanization. So rural Jews would appear to have stayed pretty traditional as long as they stayed where they were.
Probably because they could take Shabbos off.
Yes.
And if you had a boss, you can't.
Yes. I mean, in my own family, I can attest to this as well. It's only anecdotal, but they came. My mother's family came from a tiny place with a lot of Jews, and my grandmother says that never saw anybody not keeping Shabbos there. Then they moved to the city, to Munich, and they themselves got a little bit laxer for a while, I think. That's the impression I get. Some parts of the family became less observant. Some became more Orthodox because now they identified with, they started going to the Orthodox synagogue. There was only one synagogue before that where they lived. So I think there was a shift like that. I can't give you figures, but by the 1920s, I would say, there was a minority of observant Jews. If you're talking about the 1850s or 60s, that's probably the majority was still observant.
Not only was it organization, but the growth of the Nazi,
Yes.
and that whole social, cultural, which is also becomes part of unification. Right?
Yes.
That whole way of bringing people into the German culture was mainstream.
Right.
So it's very profound.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused by the Orthodox succession.
Yes.
My understanding was that, say, it was Reform succession, but everybody who left was Orthodox. What was Orthodox
Yeah.
succession from?
So there was a huge argument about this among the rabbis. So it happened, first of all, in Frankfurt, where, as I say, in the 1840s, for the first time, a majority of the board of the local community was reform-minded. And at that time, the funding stopped flowing to the more traditional institutions. It's hard to say. If you read things by the Frankfurt Orthodox community, they're, I think, a bit extreme and exaggerated. But they say that the mikveh fell completely into disrepair. There was no kosher meat and so on. It's hard to say how much that was true. But at any rate, it's true that things really turned. The tide turned. So at that point, a group of people who then took Hirsch as their rabbi. He had been a chief rabbi in Moravia before that. So he was leaving a rather distinguished position for something that was not very major, but he wanted to make a statement, to take a stand. He said, I will come, and we have to secede from the general community. And his argument was, what constitutes a Jewish community is the recognition of the sovereignty of Jewish law. If it doesn't recognize the sovereignty of Jewish law, it's not a Jewish community by definition. And therefore, actually, he would not like to use the term secession, because from his point of view, it was only from a legal point of view that it was secession. From a Jewish point of view, he represented the continuity of the Jewish community in its authentic form.
But there were no streams, basically.
Right.
Everyone was just Jewish.
Yes.
And which was basically traditional.
Yes.
And then Reform made it stream, and then in response to Orthodox
Exactly.
made it stream.
Yes.
It wasn't
The term Orthodox was very unliked. It was applied by people to their enemies. It was not a term that anybody wanted to adopt. It really comes from the Lutheran usage. In the 18th century, an Orthodox Lutheran was someone who opposed the Enlightenment and insisted on the literal word of God, what we would call a fundamentalist. And Mendelssohn sometimes applies that term, at least in private letters, he applies that term to some of his opponents. And this led to an argument later on between Hirsch and some of his Reform contemporaries, because they said, oh, well, look, Mendelssohn criticizes the Orthodox, so he wasn't Orthodox. And Hirsch says, having read Mendelssohn, he's in favor of Jewish observance. He's using the term totally differently. But the term that German Orthodox Jews preferred was Gesetzestreu, which means faithful to the law.
Nobody would let anybody's sister
Yeah. So, but anyway, what I wanted to emphasize, though, really is that, again, there's lots of interesting historical detail here, but the philosophical contribution, I think, lies in the work of people like Holdheim and Hirsch and Breuer and others who I haven't talked about, who are reflecting really on the nature of the state itself, on what citizenship is in modernity, and how can we be Jews and be citizens. Of course, Zionism complicates the question considerably. Hirsch was not a Zionist, and his family opposed Zionism because the idea that Jews were a nationality whose home country was supposed to be somewhere else, that seriously complicated their story about how you could be a Jew and you could have Jewish law but be a full German citizen. So that's a slightly different set of questions. Okay, I think we should probably stop. Yes. Okay.
We have one more?
Okay, sure.
We have one more.
Oh,
One
one
more
more class.
class.
Yes, yes, that's right. Yeah, but in
June 12th.
2 weeks' time. So I'm